Good afternoon and welcome to today's Apapa, Ohio event. My name is Grace Sang and I'm a rising senior at Hathaway Brown School from Cleveland, Ohio. Today, Claire Meng and I will be moderating today's discussion about Asian identity, featuring speaker Abigail Hengwen, New York Times best-selling author of Love Boat Taipei. For those of you coming to an Apapa event for the first time, I would like to quickly introduce the organization presenting today's speaker. APAPA was founded in 2001 with the mission of empowering Asian and Pacific Islander Americans through education, leadership, and active participation in civic and public affairs in response to the lack of API representation at all levels of government throughout the United States. Before we get started, I would like to establish the agenda for today's discussion. First, Abigail will speak, talking about her experience growing up in America as an Asian American and anything else she would like to share. Second, we'll have a quick poll with just a few questions, and then we'll have a Q&A answering first pre-submitted questions, and then we'll open up the floor to any questions you guys drop in the chat. And then lastly, we'll have a few closing comments and announcements. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Abigail Hengwen. Abigail is the New York Times bestselling author of the novel Love Boat Taipei, a romantic comedy addressing issues of identity and the immigrant experience, featured in Entertainment Weekly and the international press, and is currently being adapted for film in Hollywood. She has also written for Fortune and Forbes and speaks on AI, venture capital, diversity, and leadership in national and international venues. Abigail is an Ohio native, having attended high school in Cleveland. She holds a BA from Harvard in Government and International Relations and a JD for Columbia Law School, and has previously practiced law at many prestigious law firms, advising clients on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley. She also has experience in government, having worked in DC on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Currently, Abigail is the Partnership on AI's co-chair for the expert group on fairness, transparency, and accountability, and sits on their Transparency and Machine Learning Steering Committee. Now, I will give the floor to Abigail Hengwen to share her story.
Grace, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and Hong, thank you for organizing. I'm just really grateful to be here with so many people from Ohio, where I grew up, and then I also see folks from California. And for folks who've just joined, if you can type into the chat what city you're calling in from, it's really fun for me to see where folks are. So I thought I could start off with just a little bit of like my journey from Ohio to where I am today, and then I prefer to open it up for questions and just hear what's on your minds. So I grew up in Ohio. My parents are actually dialed in here, Ray and Barbara, and they had immigrated to the United States from the Philippines and Indonesia. And my grandparents before them had immigrated from Fujian province for my mom and Shandong for my dad. So we are, I was like two generations out of mainland China, and then, from a family that had been immigrants for 2 generations. So I think that gave us a bit of a different dynamic. In Ohio, it was, both a wonderful place to grow up and a difficult place to grow up. I think it had really great family values. People, I think, have a, strong sense of morality and, probably better work-life balance than what I found on the coasts. But it was definitely difficult growing up as one of the only Asian Americans in my class. So there was another girl who was half Korean, and there was me, and there really wasn't anyone else. There was a guy who was 2 grades above me, who was also Chinese American. And then I found like in later years, my brother and sister who were 3 years younger than me, they did have more Asian Americans in their class. And I know today it's quite different now. But I think I struggled, at a time when people didn't know who I was. So when I was younger, I had some teachers who I didn't understand until I was older why the teachers didn't seem to like me. And I think I really internalized a lot of that, that kind of shame and that hurt. And it was only later when I grew up that I understand, okay, there was probably some racism in the background that I just, as a child, I wasn't aware of. But I would have the usual teasing from kids, like who would talk to me in made up languages, or there was a girl who kept telling me I was Black, and I was really confused. I'm not Black. She goes, no, my mom says you're Black, and she's on the school board. And I remember thinking, like, I don't understand. Like, I don't know what's going on here. So, I think in some ways it was very hard, but I think that experience of experiencing that type of discrimination, racism, has made me a more sensitive person in a good way. I think it's made me the writer that I am today, because I understand, what it's like to be an outsider and to be trying so hard to fit in, and then to eventually find your place and your voice. So I left Ohio for college. I went to Harvard and I studied international relations and government. And then I walked, as Grace mentioned, I worked in Washington, D.C. I started off working for Senator Mike DeWine on the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was a lot of fun. And it was really exciting for me to be a part of the machine. Like, I think as an immigrant, you kind of feel like you're from the outside looking in. And so suddenly I was inside the machine and I got to work on immigration policy. So two things actually really stood out to me in that time. One is we actually inspected the immigration officers at the border at the airport. And I remember, like, as a child, we would sometimes run into trouble with immigration officers. We would come back from Canada after visiting my uncle and his family in Toronto, and we would get stopped and we'd be questioned in a way that, often made us feel like we were not welcome back into our own country. And, there was even a time we were detained overnight. And so suddenly I found myself in the government inspecting these same inspectors who had once, inspected us. And it was fascinating because I think there were a lot of really good people there, but there were also problems. There were inspectors who, they would show me passports. They're like, we want more of these, we want less of these. And, it was clearly not appropriate. Like, the ones they wanted more of were from Europe, the ones they wanted less of were from Asia. And so I had the opportunity to actually make a difference and talk to their supervisor and say, this is actually not appropriate. And then the other opportunity I had when I was working there was to visit a detention center for refugee asylum seekers in New York. And that was also really eye-opening. So I was walking through the corridors of this place with a bunch of other legislators and policymakers from DC, and seeing all these families and men and women and children that were behind these huge glass dormitories and just waiting to find out the status of their asylum seeking. And so I think all that was really formative for me to realize, okay, like, I've gone through all these experiences in my life, and it's given me a different type of empathy to see these things that other people may not see. So while I was in DC, going into government service, and I've talked about this a little bit on my tour, was something that my family had wanted for me. My parents had always been activists within our community, and they would actually go talk to the administrators of our high school, not for me and my brother and sister, but for other immigrant kids in the community who needed help translating across cultures. And so my parents, I grew up in communities like Apapa with organization of Chinese Americans, and like hearing a lot about, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and knowing, the challenges that generation, my parents' generation, had faced with glass ceilings in the workforce, and, of course, the other discrimination that we experience. And so I felt like, I felt a lot of expectation from the community to go into government and public service. And I found when I was in DC that it just didn't feel like the right fit to me. I felt like I didn't know, it was very hard to fit in. And it also felt like there was a lot of young people with so much power, but no life experience. And so there was a moment that I've talked about on tour where, I called my dad and I said, I can't do this. I'm going to let everybody down. Everybody who wants me to go on and be a voice for the community and to actually enact change. And I couldn't do it. And, my dad is really great. He's like, it's okay, it's all right. And for me, that was actually a significant moment where I felt like I had to go split from expectations and be my own person. And my book, Love Boat Taipei, has a similar story. So Grace talked a little bit about it. But it's about a girl named Ever Wong who also grows up in Ohio and ends up going to Taiwan for the summer on a program nicknamed Love Boat. And this is actually a real program that I went on as a sophomore, this summer between my freshman and sophomore year of college. It's a real program in Taiwan that thousands of parents have been sending their kids to since the 1960s. And it was to learn language and culture, and actually to find a spouse at a time when there was less interracial marriage in the United States. So I found myself, in this foreign country with a bunch of young adults, and it turns out there's no supervision. So the kids kind of all go crazy, and they go sneak out clubbing, they drink snake blood sake, they take glamour shots, and they also learn language and culture. We went on a tour around the island, and it really is an incredibly fun experience, but also like one of these strange secrets in the Asian American community. I think there's a certain generation of people where everybody knows someone who went on Love Boat, but very few people outside the community actually knew about it. And so I decided to write the story. But before I get there, So I after deciding like, okay, DC, this world of government politics may not be for me. We ended up moving out to California. So I started writing novels at that point. I was thinking about being a law professor, but I decided instead to just start to write a fantasy novel that I had in my head. And my husband was super encouraging. He said, you know, you're excited about this fantasy novel, just go for it. And so that was actually the beginning of my writing journey. I've been writing for 12 years. And over the next 12 years after that fantasy novel, I would send my novels out to agents, get rejected, get feedback. I got my MFA along the way at Vermont College of Fine Arts. And I got, you know, I had 2 novels come really close at major publishing houses, and they were both turned down by marketing, who couldn't figure out how we're going to market this story from an Asian American author. And this is a time before Crazy Rich Asians really opened the market for Asian American storytelling. So at the same time, I was still continuing to practice in law. So I went, so I was working on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C. for law firms. And then I went in-house when I came to California to Intel Capital, which is the venture capital arm of Intel Corporation. And there I was able to find the balance that I needed to raise my kids, do the writing, and still have an interesting practice. So I worked with a lot of startup companies in Silicon Valley, eventually moving closer and closer to the artificial intelligence startup companies, and then eventually moving into the business side to help develop, do some business development around artificial intelligence products that we were incubating within my company. And I started speaking on AI around the world, writing for Fortune and Forbes, and drawing on some of those writing and communication skills that I had been honing on in my personal life. And then Love Boat Taipei sold to HarperCollins. So I find myself now at another crossroads because I've got my book career and my film career, which is starting to take off. And then I have the artificial intelligence world that's also become fairly large, and I love it. And I think it's actually a really important part of our future. So I think I'm continuing every day to just figure out what is the right balance. But for now, I've kind of made my AI work a little bit smaller. And what I'm doing is I'm going to take over the podcast for artificial intelligence for my company, and I'll be hosting that for the short term. So why don't I stop there? And maybe, Hong, do I turn it back over to you to, if there's questions, or, you know, we could take the conversation in any direction you'd like.
So we can, you know, just in that case, we can keep on going and then, you know, go to some, do some quick polling.
Okay, great.
Okay, well, that was very interesting and helpful. I know that we can all relate to that experience, Abigail. Thank you for speaking. So before we transition into Q&A, there's going to be a quick poll that will pop on up your screen. It's just going to be 2 questions, and just click on the answer you feel best fits you.
Just for a second, when I set up, it says I'm logging to another device.
I still hear
Let me mute that first. I need to find who.
Do you want us to maybe start a question first?
Yeah, why don't you start a question? I get the poll ready, and I need to find.
Okay, so Claire, can you start with a question? You're on mute, Claire.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Meng, a rising junior at Walnut Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I guess a question we can start off with is, so with the differences between 2 generations, how do we talk about tough topics such as the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID-19 impact on Asian Americans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think even the fact that we're asking that question is like a step in the right direction. I've definitely seen during the Black Lives movement a lot of talks and people posting online about exactly that. How do you talk to your parents about Black Lives movement? And, you know, it's funny how fast the country has shifted. There was an interesting poll that came out in the New York Times about public opinion on whether or not the Black Lives movement was important. And it's actually shifted dramatically. And there's some interesting statistics now that the reason Trump's polling is slipping is because of his handling of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it does seem like it's actually become important to everyone.
Can you, everybody, if you're not talking, can you please mute yourself? Thank you.
I think overall, I feel like for Black Lives Movement, I'm really encouraged. Like, I don't think, I mean, it was at the worst cost possible. I don't think any of us are ever going to forget the image of the police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck. And that so many names have come up since then of Black people who were killed by the police. And I grew up with the story of Vincent Chin and other murders of Asian Americans. And so it just feels like things have shifted where we're actually recognizing like there was a deep systemic problem, and we're starting to address that now. So I actually feel like for Black Lives Matters, like more and more people are on the same page, and it's not as hard a conversation anymore. But I definitely think these conversations between generations are still difficult. And I don't have all the right answers, but I think the key is to recognize, like in some ways that's our advantage, is we go into every situation knowing that we're going to have to translate across cultures. And so when we recognize that people are speaking different languages, then I think that gives us a lot more freedom and flexibility to get to like a better understanding. So one example I will give from law school, I took a negotiations class, and my teacher gave us a game to play where she said, you're not allowed to talk, but it's like poker. It's very simple. She gave everyone a sheet, and she said, okay, everyone read the rules for 1 minute, and then you will start playing the game. And the rules were things like the ace is trump. If you lose, you switch tables to the right, and if you win, you go first the next time. And so, this is a bunch of law students who prided themselves on reading very carefully and following the laws very carefully. And after we read the rules, we started playing the game, and then since we couldn't talk, we had to point to each other and say, you go to that table. Like, so, after everyone played, we saw who won, everyone started pointing in different directions, and people started getting really frustrated. Like, did you not read these rules? Clearly, like the winner is supposed to move to the right table. The winner is supposed to go first, not the loser. But yet everybody was playing wrong. And so then the teacher finally calmed everyone down, and she said, actually, I gave everybody different rules. And so that was really an eye-opening experience. So that's exactly what's going on when we're communicating across cultures. Everyone's playing by a different set of rules. It's not that they're trying to be deliberately pugnacious or ignorant or difficult. It's just that you need to figure out, okay, what are the rules that you're actually playing by?
Yeah, that was a great example. Are we going to do another question, or are we going to do
Yes, let's do a poll. Let's run the poll. Can you guys see the poll right now? Oh, sorry about that. Do you see the poll? Yeah, can everybody just pick a number? Cool. So we have about 50 people responded by now. Very good. Another 5-10 seconds. So we have about 100 people responded. All right, so I'm going to end the poll right now. We have about 130 people responded. So take a look at the result. Are you surprised at the result? All right, so we can keep on going now.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing this. It's really interesting for me to see as well. I think as Asian Americans, we've always occupied a strange place in the racial discussion in the United States between Black and white. I think it's definitely, at times, I think we feel like we don't really know what our place is. And other times it does seem like we have an opportunity to step in and to speak up and play, have an important voice in the conversation.
All right. So I think another popular topic that showed up quite a bit in the submitted questions was that it appears that you've achieved the success that many Asian parents hope their kids will achieve as well, prestigious schools and successful careers. Could you talk a bit more about your personal experiences in these schools and career fields, as well as the biggest motivations and challenges?
It's a great question. You know, it's so funny. I think no matter how many things I reach, I never actually feel like I'm successful. I think for me, I've always been very, I think I've always been driven by curiosity and interest. And like I do things because I'm interested in them. And that I think has kept me maybe more mentally sound because I do things more like because I love them. So this book really, like, it made no sense for so many years. I write about it in a piece you can look at it online called Confessions of an Undercover Novelist, and how I was writing for 12 years and not telling anybody because it just didn't seem responsible. And there were times like, am I wasting my time? Am I, even when I got my MFA, I'm like, am I spending money to chase Bigfoot? But I loved it. Like I was a writer and I loved language. I loved words. I loved stories and characters. And my brother and sister taught me that as a child. I would tell them lots of stories and they were captivated by these things. And so I think that's just naturally who I am as a storyteller. And that was a benefit to me in negotiations as a lawyer, and a benefit in my company when I was presenting cases to executives or to teams to try to get people on board. Those skills ended up being really helpful. Harvard for me, when I got in, my dad said that it would open up doors for me that they couldn't even imagine. And I think that was true. Like I went to Harvard and I just met incredible people that were also really just passionate about whatever it was they were doing. Like my college roommate, who I'm still really good friends with today, Judy, Leong, she was a social studies major at Harvard. And she was really committed to working with the kids in Chinatown in Boston and trying to be like almost like a second parent to them. And that's a value that she's continued to this day, where she's now living in Pasadena, California. Her kids are in a school district where most of the kids are on meal plans. And she's just there to be like a light and blessing to them. And so, she's like one of my heroes, using her mind and her intelligence and her resources to try to serve other people. I think it was at Harvard that that gave me my entryway into the political world. I was a member of the Institute of Politics, where I had a chance to work with Senator Edward Kennedy and Alan Simpson from Colorado, and learning, I think, about the ways that they thought about issues of policy and the way they treated people. And I think all that was hugely eye-opening for me, and I needed that coming from a family of immigrants. So it's interesting today. I think my own kids, are growing up in a different world than I did, and I'm like, I don't know that they need it quite as much as I did, because they are coming to the table with more resources, and there's also more information that's just available. There's so many online classes now that are available to everybody. Anyone could take a Harvard class on Harvard X, and so I just think that it's just the field has become more and more leveled with access to information. So I think the time I grew up was a little bit different.
Yeah, for sure. So I think earlier you talked a little bit about like the discrimination and like racism you've seen. So how do you overcome it without perhaps feeling ashamed of your heritage? And do you ever feel out of touch with your culture and regret not learning more about it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So my character, Ever Wong, when she goes to Taiwan, she's actually running away from her heritage. And I think that was similar to me. Growing up in Ohio, I just wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be Asian American. I hated looking in the mirror when I was in school because I looked so different than everybody else around me. Like my eyes were a different shape, my face was flatter. I was darker than everybody. And I think I remember there was a time I actually put this into Love Boat Taipei where I packed, I can't remember what it was, but some kind of Chinese food. And when I opened my lunchbox in school, I think this was maybe second or third grade, everyone was like, oh, what is that? What's that smell? What is, and I didn't like that attention. I think there was maybe a different personality type might have enjoyed the attention, but I didn't, and I didn't want to be under scrutiny like that. So definitely going to Love Boat and meeting all these, like, you know, similar to Ever, like meeting all these Asian Americans who loved their culture and they were really into, you know, bubble tea and all the food in the streets, the night markets. They actually would joke about, you know, cultural things between them and their parents. And, you know, and that was really kind of healing for me to experience that. And similar to going to Harvard, where there's, you know, 20% of the students are Asian American. And I actually had a number of close Asian American friends for the first time. That was also really healing for me. But it's been a journey, because even as a practicing lawyer in Washington, D.C., I was the only Asian American in my law firm. And I still struggled. And just yesterday, I was talking with an executive in Hollywood who's Asian American, and he has been through the ringer. Like, I think what we found when we graduated from college is we seemed to be equal. We kind of moved into the workforce as equals, but then when we tried to move into leadership, that's when we started to run into implicit bias that Asians aren't leaders. And it was kind of an eye-opener for me, for a lot of my friends we'd always perceived ourselves as leaders, especially coming out of Harvard. So that has been a struggle and continues to be a struggle of trying to have that seat at the table. And it is hard not to take it personally. And I think what has been the most helpful is that we started talking about it with each other. So there's a story that I tell on tour where maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, a number of my girlfriends and I, Asian American girlfriends, we started saying like, okay, actually the lowest paid in my group, or I'm not able to get promoted. I got passed over for promotion twice. And once we started sharing and opening up to each other, that's when we realized, okay, like we know how good you are. Like we can't see it for ourselves when it's just you yourself, like getting passed over or not connecting with your colleagues or not connecting with senior management. You think like, okay, maybe it's just my personality, or there's something, I'm too shy, or I'm too whatever it is. But once we started seeing there was actually a systemic issue, then that made us braver. And we started to help each other. We didn't have power, but we had influence. And so we taught each other how to negotiate for a raise and negotiate for salaries. And most of all, I think just being encouraging and saying, no, you actually do deserve, there's so much more you can do for your employer, your company, or, you know, whatever it was. So, I think we're continuing to do that. And, but I think your question is exactly right. Like, I think it's really important not to take it personally and to recognize, like, you know, it's hard. There's a personal toll to having to educate people about implicit bias. But once you can remove it from yourself and take it out and look at it externally, you know, it's not you, it's this system, it's this, you know, this world that we're in. I think that makes it easier.
Yeah, that was really insightful. I guess another question is that a lot of pressure on there's a lot of pressure on Asian American students to excel academically, be very successful in their career, and make a lot of money. So how would you advise they deal with that, and what else should they pursue in addition to school?
Yes, that's a great question. And I actually, over time, have come to realize I don't think it's an Asian American thing. I think it's actually a highly educated thing. And that is because of discrimination at the borders. Like, it's very difficult for immigrants to come to this country in the first place, right? So only certain types of people can come. And for Asian Americans, for a long time, it was only through tech work or through grad school that people were able to come to this country. Everybody else stayed behind in Asia, right? And so I work and live in Silicon Valley. My kids go to schools with very highly educated parents of all races, and they all have the same value of education and hard work. And that's because that's who they are, right? Their families are academic families with well-educated parents and education has been the key to success for them. So, you know, that said, like, I am really a big proponent of embracing like the resources that we have. So I actually really don't like stories like, I think with honors, where the Harvard student gives up all his honors in order to like take care of people. It's not that I don't believe you need to have that balance in your life of caring for the people in your life. Absolutely, like those people we should prioritize our families. But I actually really don't like those stories where the Asian American student gives up all the academic resource they have to make a point. So in Love Boat Taipei, actually, part of the journey for the characters is this talent show that they all become a part of in the end. And it's actually, for me, I was like, you know, yeah, they did practice piano for many years, but like they're able to do what they want with it. Like they have those musical skills, right? So I think the key, yes, like work hard, study hard, take advantages of those resources, but you don't want to lose your humanity in the process. So I think having balance is good. Like go out, like my kid's going sailing this summer, right? It's great for him to be using his hands and using a different part of his brain to try to figure out how to capture the wind and how to make the boat move fast, right? And then music, I think, is another part of your brain. But do find what it is that you love and go pursue it, and do it, do it because you love it and not because you feel like you need to do it. I think that's part of what I mentioned earlier, just keeping mentally sound. And I think you'll make your biggest impact on the world by doing what you love.
Okay. Hello. I have a question. It's kind of hard to explain, so I couldn't write it in the chat. So I'm just gonna ask it straight out. So, because most of my friends, they're mostly American whenever I go to school, and whenever we have debates, me being Asian American, they're like compelling me to defend Chinese people. Like, should you be compelled to defend China? And like, even if you were born in America, you're an American citizen, should you be propelled or like forced to defend China?
That is a great question. I used to face that too growing up. Like it's like every question about anything Asian comes to you. Like, what do you think of this food or this restaurant? Or can you read this Chinese text? Like, no, I can't read it. So yes, no, absolutely not. You are not required to carry water for your entire race of like billions of people. But like, I think, in retrospect, when I look back on my life and saw that, people were asking me these questions, like I probably could have maybe taken it less personally and just been like, okay, like, yes, you're asking me out of like just because I'm maybe the only Asian person that you know. And it's okay to be like, there's actually a big diversity within Asian Americans. And that's something that I wanted to showcase within Love Boat Taipei. Like it has a cast of over 30 different characters and they're all different and they all have different points of view. And they actually have different points of view about Taiwan and China too. And what it means to be Asian American, and even whether they call themselves Asian American or Chinese American or Taiwanese American or just American. So I think that's the answer you can give people. Like, well, I don't actually think about this myself, but there are probably other people who do, and maybe you can go talk to them.
Thank you.
Cool. Hey, everybody, I just want to make an announcement to let's go through the prepared question. And then, people have submitted a lot of questions in the chat. We'll pick out a couple. And once that we open the mic up, then you can come up and ask a question. If you can just wait a little bit, really appreciate that. Thank you. Claire, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll ask a few more of the pre-submitted questions. So one of them was in relation to school. How do you feel about affirmative action in higher education?
Oh man, this is a really great question. I feel that the idea behind affirmative action, which is to give people opportunities to become familiar with people of different races and backgrounds, is good and helpful. I do think that Asian Americans should be considered the same as Caucasians rather than actually having it be more difficult for them.
So if you could go back and relive your teenage years, would you change anything about them?
Oh, great question again. There was a lot of good things and a lot of pain. And, I think if you try to erase all the pain, then you're probably going to be a different person. So I do feel like writing Love Boat Taipei in some ways is a full circle for me, and feeling like, okay, some of the hard things that I went through in Ohio as a minority, they did lead to this book. And this book has, like, the best feedback that I've gotten on this book is when I hear from people who say they've never felt so seen before. And that's actually been enormously important to me. And then I think the other piece that I've really felt blessed by is that the book has reached across cultures. And I think only because I grew up in Ohio and really I had to work really hard to reach cultures, bridge cultures, that's come out in the book. And the third piece is that it's reached across generations. And I think that one is something I didn't expect and I'm really grateful for. So I think all those experiences, like, I think, hopefully someday they'll be worth something for, whatever. We may not know, we may never even know why we had to go through them. But for me, at least, I'm starting to get a glimpse of what it could be.
So the next question relates to more about being a writer. So what advice would you give aspiring authors for writing about cross-cultural experiences and identity? And what are some tips you have to pursue a career in writing?
Great. So my website, I do have some frequently asked questions about the writing process and like finding an agent and all that. So, people are welcome to take a look at that. It's just my name, abigailhengwen.com. But, writing takes a lot of practice. So there's this saying about 10,000 hours, 1,000,000 words. And I think it's kind of true. Like that's partly why it took me 5 novels to publish Love Boat Taipei. I just had to learn. It's a really steep learning curve to write a novel. But yeah, I think if you want to write, you should just go for it. We need lots of stories, lots of perspectives, even within our community, because like I said, we're all different too. And I would say like the most important advice is to be yourself, because only you can write what only you can write. Because if you're trying to write imitative fiction, nobody wants to publish it because it's already been done. But there are stories that only you can tell from your own vantage point. So you want to find that voice and bring that out.
All right, I think that covers most of the pre-submitted questions on large topics. So.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Claire. I think me and Linan will take over. So first, I want to introduce myself. I'm Hong Qiu. I am the Apapa Ohio Youth Program Chair. And so a couple of the questions that I pick out from the chat, I think one asks about culture, Asian culture. In your book, you mentioned about food, bubble tea, but then it seems like, the audience was saying that what else in Asian culture that, that you are trying to sort of convey to the audience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I see one question here too about Asian Americans being successful. Is that benefited from our cultural traditions? And then on my tour, I've spoken with a number of Silicon Valley companies, and at Google, actually, this question came up as well. Like, what is it? How can we bring our Asian American culture to the table? So again, like recognizing that we're all different, but I think there's a couple pieces. The immigrant experience is actually hugely beneficial. It can be very difficult, but it gives us a perspective between cultures. Like I grew up in a family, that was very multicultural, because my mom is, as I said, is from the Philippines, my dad from Indonesia, and I would go back to visit family there. And every story has multiple sides to it. My uncles would have like conspiracy theories about, the West and China. And these were things that I was reading in my textbook in Ohio. And so that perspective is incredibly valuable. And I think as the world becomes more and more diverse, like that perspective is really valuable to have at the table. Like, let's consider this from multiple sides, and then you end up with a better outcome when you really do that. I think also just going through the immigrant experience, like my parents went through a lot, their friends went through a lot just to survive in this country, and having that heritage of resilience and in the face of adversity, that's really what most of life is about, is just pushing through some really hard times. And I think on my way to this book and on my way to the role that I have now at my company, it's really hard along the way. I'll give an example of there was someone at work who was trying to undermine me, and my manager had to protect me over and over again. It was really stressful. And I was, part of me was like, do I even deserve to be protected? Maybe again, it's like the insecurity, but I got through it. And then I ended up with a better role than the other roles that I was trying to get at the time. And so all that kind of took a lot of grit and perseverance and enough self-belief to get there. And also the just encouragement of people around me. And I think that's partly seeing how my own parents have just continued to move through life, despite all odds. So, and then I think I love that we have strong family values in our culture. I remember I have a good friend of ours. He's the husband is Caucasian, the wife is Chinese American. He was joking. He's like, yeah, in Asia, you take so much better care of your parents. Like in our country, we just chuck them into nursing homes. That was his words, not mine. But, I think that that sense of family values and care for family. And even, I feel that even among non-Asian Americans who aren't blood family, but when you meet each other, I think there's that sense of community that we have that I think other cultures may not have as readily. And that's been enormously helpful and beneficial, especially lately. I feel like Asian Americans have realized, like, okay, we do need to help each other, and they're much more actively trying to do so. That's been an incredible blessing.
Those are great points. So I think among the questions submitted and also the chats, there are a lot of focus on how to communicate within the family. Especially if the first generation is an immigrant and then second generation were born here, because of the culture difference and your experience difference, there sometimes can be a huge kind of a understanding gap between the two generations, such as, Asians, we are very much emphasizing on the family value, right? Mm-hmm. And your parents, they want to do the best for you. So then they say, why don't you become a doctor? Why don't you be a lawyer? But then for you, you might want to dance, you might want to write. So how do you bridge that? And also, the way how their generation kind of decides who to date, when to date, about sexual behavior, all those can be quite different. I think there are a couple of questions submitted from parents. They're very frustrated. They say, oh, I have an adult child, but then on different topics, let's say AA, L or B or N, I just couldn't, how do I talk to them because they are just so far apart? So what advice will you give it to people?
Yeah, no, so I don't know that I have all the answers to this for sure. It's complicated and every family is going to be different with their own sets of struggles. I think, as I mentioned, just patience, and we definitely didn't have patience. I didn't have patience growing up, and so it's something I feel like I'm still growing into. I think, for my book Forever, she had to find the courage to actually tell her parents how much she loved to dance, and I think I had to have some of that too. It took me until I published my book, until I got a book contract, before I could tell my parents I was writing my book. It's really these things that are so close to your heart. They can be hard to share because it makes you vulnerable and you don't know how people will react, right? I think from the younger generation, just letting your parents in more, but that can be hard. I understand that can be hard. But if you don't share who you really are and what you want, then nobody will ever know that they can even help you that way, right? So, once I shared my book with my parents, they've been incredibly supportive of trying to help with the whole book launch, right? And if I didn't tell them that I'd written this book, that wouldn't even be on the table. So then for parents, I think it's tricky. I see a question about if your child does not like practicing music, would you make him practice? And again, I don't have all the answers, but with my two children, one of them is very musical. So he is a composer. He's at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And he has always loved music. Since he was a baby, he would cry if the wrong song was turned on the radio. The song that he loved was not on, right? So, and we always had recognized that he's the one who wants to sit in the streets listening to the musicians, and everybody else wants to leave already, right? So he's continued with that. But my older son, he's more interested in stories and storytelling and programming. And when he was in 6th grade, he decided he didn't want to play piano anymore. And that was hard for me because I played piano my whole life until I went to college, and I loved music and it's a big part of my life. And so it was hard for me to agree to that. But it freed him up to pursue other things that he loves. So yeah, I think if your kid does not like practicing music, on the one hand, yes, nobody likes to practice. And there is a level of discipline that is beneficial to everybody. But if they love something else, I would say just steer them towards that, because that's what, I feel like almost everything that you love can be steered towards something interesting and productive, and maybe then put your efforts towards that.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, kind of a suggestion. So I think there are also a lot of questions on bias, on, systematic racism. How do you tear them apart if you are experiencing, say, racism or systematic racism or implicit racism or all those? And of course, you did talk about glass ceiling and all those. So what is the proper way to fight for your own right as Asian American?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's really hard. I don't think we figured it out yet. I definitely have faced this. I actually am putting a talk together where I was in a manager's office, maybe 5 years ago, and he said, he was my new manager. I had a bunch of new managers over a very short period of time, and he said, what do you want for your career? And I said, well, I'd like to manage people. And he I said, I'd like to manage. Can you help me become a manager? And he kind of blinked at me and he said, you mean manage people? And it was one of those moments that Barack Obama talks about in his memoir, when a Black child experiences racism for the first time. Like, it's this aha moment, this loss of innocence. And, you know, I had had that experience as a child in Ohio with racism. But since then, I felt like, you know, I'd gone to Harvard, I'd come out as a leader, I was working with CEOs on Wall Street. And suddenly I was in this office with this manager who didn't see me. Like, he didn't see any of those skills that I was bringing to the table, or that passion. And so for many years, I actually tried really hard to change his perception of me. And it's actually only very recently that I'm like, you know what, he is actually never going to see me as a leader. And that's okay. You know, I don't actually have to prove it to him anymore. But it was very difficult. I do think it's very hard to overcome systemic bias by ourselves. And so for me, when I went for 2 promotions at work, and I came in number 2 for both of them. And it was for the same reasons. Like, this person was also involved in those conversations. They said I had a great executive presence, and I was really good at building a rapport with people, but I was not as detail oriented as the person that they chose. And clearly, like, when you think about who is a manager, it's not the person who's detail oriented. I mean, although details are important, it's actually the reverse, right? And so, and then in the other case, they said I was not technical enough, or I was not as technical as the guy who was taken. And actually, women get that a lot. So I think that was a really low point for me in my career. And then everything changed. There was an Asian American woman in my department who had randomly just helped me at a function one time. And so she had offered to help me prepare for these interviews for for the 2 applications I was going for. And because she spent time with me, preparing me for the interviews, she saw my resume, she saw me present, she saw me do a practice interview with her. She knew what I was capable of, and she saw me. And she called me right after that. She says, I know you're really disappointed. I've been in the same shoes before, where I was head and shoulders above my competitor and I was passed over. You got to just stick with it. It'll be okay in 2 years. And then she gave me an opportunity to speak on artificial intelligence at a women's conference in Manhattan. And that was my first artificial intelligence opportunity. And she was able to do that because she had power in the organization. She was responsible for giving out those speakerships. And that opened up the door for me to do more. So then my manager, who was also championing me through that process, so he ended up creating a role for a new job for me. So I ended up becoming his chief of staff, and then became a senior director for AI for the CTO office. And again, it's because he had the power to do that, that he was able to give me those roles. So that actually taught me, like, we need allies, and we need, and if we have that power, then we need to exercise it to help people who are being overlooked. And we need to see people for who they are. So again, like I said, there's a lot of people who have influence but not power. And so then there's ways you can help each other laterally. So, but I think the key, again, it comes down to letting people know that you need help. Like, they saw how bad I went. And I think it was like, I could have been ashamed, like there's part of our culture that I think is negative, which is the deep shame that we can take on ourselves. And I could have been really ashamed, like, oh, maybe I'm just a really bad worker. That's why I can't get promoted. But I think having these people around me and people who did know what I was capable of, to encourage me, that was enormously important.
Yeah, those are really great advice. I think it is at my workplace, I think the Indian Americans, they are doing a great job trying to help each other out. But they are, you know, I think there are a lot of things that other ethnic groups, if we want to say it that way, they can learn from. So just kind of turning back to another really hot topics among the Asian parents, it's education. You know, we Asians, we emphasize on the value of education. So you went to, you know, kind of the best school on the planet. You went to Harvard. What did you learn from, you know, the experience from Harvard? How do you think you benefit from there? And then if, let's say, you didn't really get to go to Harvard, but maybe you went to community school, you know, how do you think, what kind of a difference would the education really make in terms of a person's life? So how important is a great education? How hard do we have to fight because we want a great education for our kids?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question. I think coming out of Asia, going to the top schools really didn't seem to matter. Like, I remember some of my Indian American friends telling me, like certain tests that they would take, and I don't actually know much about this, but certain tests that they had to take would make the difference between being in a call center and actually having like a high-tech job, right? And this was years ago, of course. And I don't think the world is like that anymore. I do think in this country, talent does rise. But I mean, certainly it helped for me to have the Harvard education when I was facing implicit bias at work. I mean, I still faced implicit bias with the education I've had. And so that tells me that it's going on everywhere. I think the education can be found everywhere because, again, there's so much available online. Khan Academy has democratized math learning and other learnings for everybody. And there's a lot of effort being made to just make these available everywhere. So no matter where you go, you can still access really great teaching. I think sometimes it's hard to know what is good. Like it's hard to filter out like the good information from the bad information. So being able to follow people online who you can trust are actual real thought leaders, and you can trust their advice. That's important. Making sure you have good information. And I think something that can be the hardest part to filter out. Like I do feel like my friend circle coming out of Harvard, they have very good information. I really trust what they tell me about COVID or, you know, pandemic or about the state of the economy. And I try to share that out as much as I can. But I do sometimes run into circles of people where the information is less strong, and then I worry that that's the circle that will say like, oh, you don't really need to wear a mask, or you know. So I think maybe always checking to make sure you're getting good judgment and good information. But I do think like with affirmative action, you know, we're going to see a lot of people, you know, you may not get into the schools that you want to, but I think people recognize that too. Like when you go out and get hired, and I actually write about this in the book Taipei, like there's more jobs in the world than there are slots in universities. So if you don't get into the top choice of your, you know, college, like you still like go and you do a great job at whatever it is you are studying and what you love, and then you'll get the jobs that you're looking for, because, you know, people want to see excellence, and you can show that regardless of what school you went to.
All right, sounds good. So my last question before we open the floor up for the audience to ask. So someone asked about the, you know, model minority, Asian, we are the model minority. And we asked a lot of our summer interns to watch the PBS documentary, Asian American, and then inside the documentary, it also talked about model minority. So to us, you know, sometimes it's kind of a motivation to try to work hard to fit into that stereotype, but then many times it might not be really doing, I don't know. So what's your thought on us being model minority, and what's the impact of us being model minority on, let's say, on the Blacks? So how do you see that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah, I don't love this concept either, because it definitely puts us in a box. And, you know, there's probably benefits of being a model minority when you're trying to be hired at the rank and file level, because then the expectation is that you'll be a good worker. It's harder when you try to move into leadership, especially in Silicon Valley, where we're looking for disruptors who are going to push against the status quo and turn over industries and entrenched leadership. Love Boat Taipei actually is about a bunch of kids who are rebelling. I think that's partly what makes it, why people were intrigued to read it, is because these kids are not acting like model minorities. They're betraying each other, and they're sneaking out, clubbing, and making really stupid decisions, but then they also recover from the decisions, and they go on to make better choices. And, you know, that was important to me, is to show like, hey, you know, like we're really multifaceted individuals. I think that's what model minority does. It kind of just makes you into this like one little box, and we're so much more complicated than that as individuals and as people. Yeah, I definitely think like I hate when people use me as a point of comparison to Black Lives movements. Like I'm sure all of us have had those comments that are really racist, when they go, why, you know, you're so good, why can't everyone be like you, right? In a racist way. And, you know, I think we should call that out when we hear that, like, you know, hey, you know, that's not appropriate. But, you know, I think the other problem with the model minority myth is that it hides people within the Asian American community that come from more challenging backgrounds, and then they can't get the help that they need. It also, like one of the things I cover in Love Boat Taipei is learning differences. So, you know, there's a character who's dyslexic. And then in my next book, I'm kind of touching on ADHD a bit, but, you know, learning differences, mental health issues like depression, like these are all real, even within the communities of people that would count as model minorities. And it's hard to get help for that if we only want to see perfection, or we can only see perfection.
So now that we can open the floor up to have a couple questions, maybe 5 questions answered before we wrap up today's event. Anybody wants to go first? Oh, Mr. Shiro Tanaka, can you unmute yourself? Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay. All right,
Yeah.
can you hear me? Okay.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. I'm probably only one guy from Japan, and also I'm 85 years old, so I'm your grandpa's age. I'd like to make 3 suggestions to this group. One, I consider the Jewish group as model minority. Look how, they are small in number, but how they dominate finance, art, the entertainment. We should copycat them, Now, they are considered white, so that's their advantage. But that's one thing we should, and they educate, education is their top priority in their families. We do the same, But one thing they are advanced and which is the copy about is they know how to negotiate. Okay, they know how to sell yourself. We don't. And I think as parents of Asian families, we should copycat Jewish family, teach our kids, okay, you have to sell yourself, bring out your strengths, and how to advance, be competitive. That's one thing. Number 2, we should be tough. We are because our statues are smaller than the big guys, particularly Asian women. That's why we are picked on. So we have, however we may be small inside, we have to be tough in our mind. When we are attacked on the street as, hey, go back to your own country, we have to stand up and argue back against that kind of assault, okay? And we should teach in families and groups. We have to teach our children how to stand up on bullying. Okay, those are 2 points. Thank you. Okay. Okay, then maybe one more thing. Okay, language, because I'm the first generation immigrant, and I notice first generation Chinese immigrant, we have accents, and that's very tough to improve, but that will hinder us. But fortunately, our children and the grandchildren, they speak so-called perfect American English, just like, Abigail, So I think that's we can have more hope for linguistic improvement in speaking and writing, giving lectures. I think, the first generation is out, but second and third generations, I think, I'm sure they will do better.
Thank you for sharing. I think I would say my hope is that when we hear an accented voice, we think that's brilliant. When we hear British accents, people tend to think it's smarter. I think when we hear a Japanese accent or a Chinese accent or a Korean accent, I hope people think that's brilliant. And I feel like there are universities where like the faculty are from foreign countries and they have those accents. And I think, I think people recognize that those professors have amazing minds. I think that's partly the role of entertainment to help change these perceptions too.
Any other questions?
May I ask a question next?
Yes, go ahead.
So I had a question on how do you think your choice to pursue law influenced your career as a writer, and how and why did you choose your major and the career path that you are in right now?
Yeah, so I realized I didn't finish the story when I said that I called my dad and I said I don't think I can do this political world. So it's funny, like in some ways I've come back to that through my writing. Now by publishing Love Boat Taipei, like I've done a lot of interviews, I've been able to talk and have that voice that, you know, I thought I was initially pursuing through government and law. So definitely my background with law and politics, it continues to shape how I look at the world. Like I still care very deeply about justice and bias and oppression and poverty. And so those are all the same values that led me to law. And I think they're the same values that continue to drive me as a writer. I think on a practical level, I learned a lot from clerking for a judge, where we would write opinions of the court on top of each other. So she would write draft 1, I would write version 2, she'd write version 3 on top of mine, and back and forth. And that was incredible writing training. And then just being able to learn how to structure a story. I think I loved law school because I was reading case law from, you know, the railroads and like the accidents that would happen then. And so I thought it was a really fun way for me to learn about American history through stories, which for me has always been more tangible than kind of like vague philosophical questions.
Abigail, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I have a suggestion. Could you announce your name and which city you come from before you ask a question? Because we don't
Sure.
see you.
Yeah. Hi, Abigail. This is Leah from Austin, Texas. So I'm wondering, shouldn't we be pursuing a society that offers equal opportunity as opposed to equal results? You can see where I'm coming from in terms of affirmative action. I am totally for providing help to people who are struggling. So, but the question is that why is an Asian child who grows up struggling in Chinatown, or a poor white kid is less deserving than a poor black kid? I think they're all deserving. So to me, it seems like we probably should be providing more help in the elementary level and let people catch up, as opposed to pursuing the kind of racial quota in college admissions or, you know, company recruiting and so forth. So just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the system is broken, and I think it's very complicated how to fix it. I completely agree. All children are deserving, and I think, yeah, I mean, we're even struggling with my own community here. Like, you know, in California, there's a new legislation that's been passed to put affirmative action back into the schools, into the universities system, and you know, it's very controversial. I think what's hardest of all is, as Asian Americans, we're still caught in the middle, right? So we go through discrimination, we experience racism, but it's still harder for us to get into colleges. And I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah, it seems like Asian Americans should create a new battleground instead of just agreeing with affirmative action, which is say, hey, this is what we or the whole country will be better off if we have equal opportunity and so forth. So
yeah, I've heard some good ideas around trying to just expand the pie, which is always my preference as a negotiator. I always try to expand the pie so that more people can benefit from it. So if we have more slots in universities, more universities, you know, I think that there's probably a lot of other ways to come at the problem. I don't work in that world, so I don't feel like I have necessarily good solutions myself, but I know there's some really good thinkers in the area. And like, you know, if you guys have ideas, I encourage you to make your voices heard. Like, I think with social media these days, anybody can start to, you know, create a following on blogs or Twitter and just keep putting your voice out there, because that's something we haven't done as a community. For example, even with Love Boat Taipei, like we found that Asian Americans were the least likely to rate books online. So like on Goodreads, a lot of the recommendations or reviews of Love Boat Taipei are not from the Asian American community, even though that's a big part of the readership. So I think we just need to be more brave about putting our opinions out there.
yes, for sure. Thank you.
Oh yeah, just to add to that, it's not really a question, it's just a comment. So because I've been to a lot of like college Zoom meetings where it's like Asian Americans, and they explain to you like, well, what's the best way of getting into college? Well, one of the things was to be more stand out. I think that because we're the second generation, well, not just that we're the second generation, it's just that Americans, whenever they hear an Asian, they're like, oh, the guy must be really good at, the person must be really good at math. He must be really good at something STEM related. So you become like a stereotypical Asian. Like, I don't, well, this is not a question, but I'm just saying I don't like how they purposely, like, we can't stand out now just because we're interested in STEM. We won't be able to stand out as much as the other people just because this is like a stereotypical thing. You can't stand out with it.
Yeah, I know it's hard. I mean, I say if you love STEM, just do STEM. Don't worry about, you'll be able to find the STEM jobs that you like because you love it. Yeah, and I think employers recognize, like, if they, when they interview you, like, they understand like how the university system works, and they understand like if you're crushing it with like your interesting original research in your whatever college it is you're in, and you've taken all these like great classes, and you've done Kaggle competitions, right? Like, there's other ways for you to stand out to employers, like besides just having that particular university on your transcript. Right. And then once you're in the door, like, it's really all bets are off.
Yeah. So let's have 2 more questions before we wrap things up. Great discussion.
Abigail, I would like to ask a question for you. My name is Julie. I am a freshman at Dublin Jerome High School in Ohio, and I just want to like hear your thoughts about how our generation, like my generation and my parents, we have vastly differing political views and values and beliefs. So how would you bridge the gap and make that communication kind of open up? I know we've touched on this earlier, but I just want to hear like your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Sure. Is there a specific question you have in mind? If you don't feel comfortable sharing, that's fine too.
I was thinking mostly about the Black Lives Matter movement and how I know how like my parents, like how they feel about it is not necessarily how I feel about it, and neither of us are like inherently wrong. It's just we see it from different perspectives.
Right. Yeah, so again, no easy answers. I think the benefit that we have is that we're engaging in these conversations because you have it in your own home, right? Like, these conversations are happening all over the country, all over the world, and the outcome of these conversations is actually incredibly important to the direction that our policies and law in the country will take, right? So you have an opportunity to practice that within your own family. It's harder sometimes within your own family because it can be more emotional and more charged, and there's more, history with each other. But I think listening well is really important. There's a skill that we try to practice in my house of repeating back to the other person what it is that they said. And that actually is I saw that when I was in law school. Like, some of the most beloved faculty, when you talk to them, they repeat everything you say back to you, but in their own words and with so much empathy that you feel incredibly, incredibly heard. You know that whatever, even if they disagree with you afterwards, you know that everything you've said has been understood by them deeply. And so I think that's actually the most important starting point, is just trying to understand from the 4 corners of the earth, like, where is this other person coming from? And then you can talk about like your thoughts, and then you can respond more fully because you know what to address and you're not kind of addressing straw man arguments.
Hi, Abigail. Sorry about that. Hi, Abigail. I'm Raymond. I'm a rising high school senior from Princeton, New Jersey. I just had a quick question about, so in your political consulting and also all the political work that you have done throughout your career, do you feel like the constant upbeat schedule of political work is reflective in certain popular high school extracurricular activities such as Model UN, Model Congress? Do you think those activities accurately reflect the hierarchical structures and daily work schedule of political activity?
Oh, interesting question. I think they reflect, those are great clubs, by the way, and I think that they're important from the thought leadership perspective because you're thinking about important questions, and I remember those questions being very relevant. Like, they're really well chosen and very timely, and actually the same types of questions that real policymakers are grappling with. I don't know about the schedule though, because I think like a school extracurricular schedule won't be anything like the real world. I think the real world is like in DC, it's like 9 to 5, 9 to 9, and if you're on a campaign, it's like 24 hours around the clock. So it really just depends. Like, I think you can find all kinds of schedules in the political world.
Yeah, sure. Because like I was thinking, because I'm interested deciding between two majors because I'm going to be applying to college in the coming academic year, and economics is a field that I find to be quite artificial, quite objective oriented. Same thing with politics, but politics I find that besides all of the political party affiliation and the deep political narratives, complex political narratives that we're encountering every single day, especially during this contentious time period during the pandemic. I feel like it's just, you can see the intersections between these two different fields and how they sort of combine different aspects of human nature, dealing with human morality, human ethics, and stuff like that. So I just find that to be really interesting. So thank you so much for doing this talk today.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
All right, so let's entertain one last question from Wayne. Wayne Ho.
Hi, I'm Wayne. I'm a senior, a rising senior right now. First of all, thank you, Abigail, for being here today. Thank you for the talk. Thanks everyone for the awesome questions. So I've been talking to my parents about Black Lives Matter, and one way I've been kind of communicating is that my hope is that all the support that all these different minority groups are lending to the movement right now is something I hope to see in the future, in a potential movement, some sort of activism movement for Asian Americans. That I would see this these relationships being built right now and the support being reciprocated.
Wayne, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, Wayne, we couldn't really hear you. Sorry about that. So, but anyway, in that case, let's wrap things up. So, the last question for you, Abigail, is that how do we, help or support and stay connected to you and then to the book to know where things are? How can we help you to push the book to become a movie?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. So I'm also just really grateful for everyone who came today and for all the great questions. And I'm sorry we were not able to get to all of them. Best way to kind of follow along is sign up for my newsletter on my website, which is www.abigailhengwen.com. And I will send out notes about the film and any new books and also new events. So I see someone asked me, am I having another event? Yes, I'm having the event in Malaysia, which is open to everybody. If you follow me on my website or on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, you'll also see like my posts where I kind of push these out so people can find them. For the book itself, this is my debut year, and because of COVID, we had a lot of traction with the bookstore. So Barnes & Noble chose Love Boat Taipei as one of their book club picks. And so it was actually in all their bookstores, like on front stands, but then because of COVID, nobody was in the bookstores. So if you haven't bought the book and you're interested, like I encourage you to get it from a Barnes & Noble or an independent bookstore rather than an Amazon, because it helps to support the work of those bookstores. And they're really the engine behind this book and then pushing it out into their communities. So Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores. And then the last thing is, I mentioned Asian Americans tend to not rate very much. And so, if you could take some time to rate the book on Amazon and Goodreads, that's actually enormously helpful, and it helps to get our voice out there too.
That's great. Thank you so much. So thank you for taking the time. So before we wrap up, I want to share a little bit information about our for 2020, something to be mindful about. Let me make sure I can see my own slide. So in 2020, there are a couple of different really important things. Number one is that 2020 is an super important year. It's a census. So make sure that you answer the census question, and make your friends, your family, your coworker, make sure they answer the census. Super important. And of course, in November, this year's the general election. So register and then make sure you vote. You vote, your family vote, your friends, your coworker. Make your voice heard. Be part of this. And also, we all know 2020 is the COVID-19. If just do whatever that you could to help with the relief effort. Just be a good part of the community. Want to also let you know that currently, right now, at this exact moment, there's a presidential town hall going on Facebook. You can go to Facebook, vote, and watch the presidential town hall. So Abigail, I want to ask you, will it be possible for you to answer some of the questions that we didn't have time to address today on the APAPA Ohio Facebook periodically?
Yeah. If you want to just kind of send me a link and point me towards the questions, I'm happy to come in and just try to answer online.
All right, that's great. So for all the meeting attendees, we are going to have a drawing at the end of the event offline. And if you want to be part of the drawing, enter like love boat and your state in the chat. We are going to go over all those and pick a couple of lucky winners from people, participating in today's event. So once again, thank you so much for being part of it, and thank you so much for Abigail to be here, and for Grace and Claire to be our hosts, and for Nan to provide the technical support. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you so much.